We're sure you'll enjoy the following report.
I used to be a Jehovah's Witness, and now I criticize the group on this channel. So I'm obviously a bit biased. I think that the group has a lot of problems and needs to change if it wants to be ethical or moral. But sometimes I like to play this game in my head where I pretend that I'm the head of a PR firm, a cynical, greedy PR firm who just wants to make Watchtower's image better. Not improve the group, but improve the perception of the group without changing any of the underlying problems. Is a game I like to play in my head for fun. But no matter the angle I try and take in my head, I think the group is on an irreversible, inevitable slide towards irrelevancy. The triple I. Jehovah's Witnesses are a pseudo-Christian, high-control, high-demand religion, and all things considered, it is a pretty good time to be a pseudo-Christian, high-control, high-demand religion, especially if you believe in doomsday and some kind of satanic conspiracy with the United Nations.
The one thought refers to the nations being willing to hand over power, their political power, to the scarlet-colored wild beasts of the United Nations.
But Jehovah's Witnesses are not thriving like Christian nationalism or other groups are. In their best years, they're at a plateau, but overall, they're on a slow and steady decline, and kind of have been. There are things the group obviously should do if they want to be moral and not evil. Becoming mandatory reporter of child sexual abuse, not forcing members to die instead of receiving a blood transfusion, getting rid of mandated shunning, disfellowshipping, removal, whatever new word they want to use for it to wriggle out of consequences with the law. But in my opinion, it's unlikely that they'll change those things. So sometimes I wonder, from a greedy cult leader's perspective, like the governing body, what do they think they could change superficially to boost the group's PR without having to change the underlying problems with the religion? Well, I think they've got a pretty uphill battle. I think I have an idea of what they are trying to do, and I also have some ideas as to why that's not working. So if you're a former witness who's getting a little bit antsy because times are uncertain and you're worried that the group might be right, this video is for you, because they're not. If you're a Jehovah's Witness who's just curious to see what a former member is criticizing about your religion, I hope you stick with me, because I actually think you might agree with a lot of these criticisms. These criticisms I'm making in this video are not necessarily based on morality or what I perceive as right or wrong, but things that I think are just really inconvenient for the group as a brand. And if you're from Watchtower, like the leadership of Jehovah's Witnesses, I hope you keep watching too, because you're going to get free PR advice from the world-famous Jake's PR Corner. So, for a change, this is a mostly unironic, not snarky video, but to get into my actual public relations corner, I am going to have to play a sound drop, which is a little silly.
Have you ever heard the expression, trial by media?
I do have to play that. It's the law. First, I think we should rip off a couple Band-Aids. They have a brand problem. I don't know that it's an entirely toxic brand like Scientology, but it is not positive. So no matter who you are watching this, Jehovah's Witness, never witness, former witness, what do you think most normal people who are not Jehovah's Witnesses think of when they hear that name? As an example, McDonald's. If I say McDonald's and gave you 10 seconds, what does McDonald's make you think of? You're probably going to think of like
Big Mac, cheeseburgers, McNuggets, golden arches.
You might start to think of how gross and unhealthy the food is for you. Now let's do something similar with Jehovah's Witnesses. When most normal people who are not Jehovah's Witnesses hear that name, what do they think of? For the first 28 years of my life, I knocked on doors talking to non-Jehovah's Witnesses, trying to bring them into the religion, so I have a pretty good sense of what it was like when I was a witness, and I would say that frankly, even now that I'm not a witness, when I tell people that I used to be one, the complaints or perceptions or their idea of what witnesses are is pretty much the same. And it's all pretty bad. I don't think that a Jehovah's Witness would disagree with me when I say this, so sound off in the comments if you do disagree, prospective JW viewer. 1, the group is no fun. You're not allowed to celebrate birthdays, Christmas, Halloween, normal events that society gets excited for. 2, blood transfusions. They're not allowed to have blood transfusions. And 3rd, people know that they go door to door, a thing that maybe they appreciate if they're already a hardcore Christian, but probably most people think is just annoying or inconvenient. So right off the bat, I would say that the 3 things that Jehovah's Witnesses are most known for are negative. Not morally negative, but just it's about stuff that you are not allowed to do. Not allowed to celebrate things. Not allowed to have blood transfusions. And the 3rd thing is you have to do a thing that most people really have no desire to do. Also, and this is a huge one, the name is confusing. The Jehovah part confuses people. Witnesses confuses people. And the apostrophe, nobody knows understands how to use an apostrophe these days. Have you seen comment sections on YouTube videos? Like and subscribe. These are pretty serious problems, and I think that they're intractable. They can't reverse them really without changing the core identity of the group. They'll occasionally change a doctrine, an understanding of scripture, or something aesthetic, like whether or not men can wear beards.
Now, this means we have to adjust our understanding. Another change.
But none of those really get to the core identity of the group. They may change the way the preaching door-to-door stuff works, but they're not going to get rid of preaching. They'll change what 1914 means in Bible prophecy, but they won't change 1914 being important to Bible prophecy, if that makes sense. The stuff they can change is the doomsday part of their religion. Man, these guys really blew it as a doomsday cult. It is a pretty good time to be a group that preaches that Armageddon is coming any day now. The field is ripe for harvesting vulnerable people at the end of their rope. Historically, Jehovah's Witnesses, like most Christian groups and other high-control groups, have done best in times of global crisis and uncertainty, and Armageddon is baked into the beliefs of Jehovah's Witnesses. And wow, did they construct a theology that just doesn't make any sense with today's modern world? 1. Israel-Palestine. Wait, give me a minute. As a Jehovah's Witness, when you're preaching door-to-door, you're supposed to tie in current events. If you knock on somebody's door and they answer, and you get a little conversation started, you can talk about how world events tie into Bible prophecy. One of the key world events right now takes place in Israel. And unlike every other Christian group who insist on a modern fulfillment of Bible prophecy, Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe that the state of Israel matters at all. In fact, just a few months ago, Watchtower published an article on the front page of their website that outlined their reasons for not believing in the traditional evangelical understanding of Israel's role in end-time prophecies. It makes sense why a lot of Christians feel that Israel and Palestine are important to modern-day events. Those are places actually mentioned in the Bible. Not just mentioned, they're the protagonists. The Old Testament is all about Israel's liberation after exile, and the New Testament is all about Jesus, who was born in Bethlehem, which is modern-day Palestine. Meanwhile, the United States, Russia, and the Anglo-American world power are not mentioned in the Bible. And unfortunately for the governing body, that's where they put all of their chips. This leaves Jehovah's Witnesses in this embarrassing situation where their pitch to prospective converts is, when the Bible prophesies about Israel, it means spiritual Israel, which means us, Jehovah's Witnesses.
And for more than 100 years, spiritual Israel has been enjoying Jehovah's favor, the great spiritual temple that Jehovah is using today, Bethel. I want to go with the spiritual Jew, a sampling of why Jehovah is so proud of the spiritual Jew.
Those quotation marks just feel problematic to me. And most devastatingly, it is an own goal.
Oh, it's an own goal!
Jehovah's Witnesses used to be an explicitly Zionist movement. The Watchtower magazine, for which the group is most famous, was originally called Zion's Watchtower. I'm mentioning a lot of terms that are now very important to global events, so I just want to be clear that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide. I don't think that Zionism is good. I think that Watchtower, cynically, is stupid for having abandoned this because it would have been beneficial to them right now. Modern-day witnesses are aware that from its earliest moments, the group was prophesying about the relevance of 1914. But most Jehovah's Witnesses do not know, as I did not know, that a lot of Russell's early prophecies involved the state of Israel. J.W. Fax has an excellent breakdown of Watchtower's past statements on Zionism, which I will link in the description. But this quote from Russell's third volume of Study in the Scriptures sums it up nicely.
That the re-establishment of Israel in the land of Palestine is one of the events to be expected in this day of the Lord. We are fully assured by the above expression of the prophet. Notice particularly that the prophecy cannot be interpreted in any symbolic sense.
Charles Taze Russell said that the prophecy can only be interpreted literally and cannot be interpreted in any symbolic sense, whereas modern-day Watchtower, the current-day governing body, say that the prophecy can only be interpreted in a symbolic sense. Oops.
Another change.
I want to be clear that Watchtower are not anti-Zionist. They just truly don't have any opinion on Israel because they think that when the Bible has prophecies that apply to modern-day Israel, it just means Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, I know that it says this prophecy applies to Israel, but it means spiritual Israel, and that means us, me, the person preaching to you right now.
Which just kind of goes against common sense. Along those lines, Russia, 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 Russia. According to Jehovah's Witnesses, the Bible's prophesied King of the North represents modern-day Russia, who is supposedly fighting with the Anglo-American world power, the United States and the UK, and blah, blah, blah. They're a little vague on that. This interpretation made a lot more sense when the United States and Russia were rivals and were fighting, but the world order has changed rapidly since Trump 2.0, and now the King of the North and the King of the South are working together, and the US is alienating its former allies like Europe. They're messing up the Anglo part. Now, in fairness, by which I mean cynically and nefariously, governing body member Jeffrey Jackson sort of tried to get ahead of this late last year by implying that in the time of the end, massive earth-altering changes would happen suddenly.
Suddenly.
But he was mostly referring to their interpretation of the United Nations as it relates to their Bible prophecy. Right now, the United Nations might seem like a toothless entity.
At the moment, it's like a toothless organization, isn't it?
But very soon, any day now, just around the corner, Jehovah God will lovingly implant ideas into the leaders of the United Nations and all the governments worldwide to make them do totally insane things that ends up in Jehovah's Witnesses having the correct interpretation of the Bible. And that idea is that all the governments in the world will give their power to the United Nations, and then the United Nations will ban all religions worldwide, and Jehovah's Witnesses will be the only ones left standing. Okay, sorry, that was a lot.
That seems unbelievable. No nation does that.
All that being said, I do think there are some things that work out in their favor a little bit. Maybe. One thing I think they have going for them as a brand is, ironically, their political neutrality. Among some classical evangelicals in the United States specifically right now, there's a little bit of discomfort with the way that the Catholic Church has become synonymous with the Republican Party.
We've seen increases in division and hatred in our culture, and a decrease of Christian faith in our world. See, I think it's because the church somewhere got lost about 40 years ago and started combining with politics.
Some of you bring politics into the church. You think that politics is spiritual stuff. Politics is of this world. You think it's your duty to be political about this, that, and the other. No!
There are already a lot of pastors and local church leaders saying that the churches need to get back to Jesus and remove themselves from politics. That's happening now, and I don't see that trend reversing in the near future. Witnesses have a little bit of an opportunity there. I can also see a situation where a lot of people become increasingly disillusioned with politics. I'm talking about this from a United States standpoint, right? So there is already a market for nominally apolitical churches, and Jehovah's Witnesses in some ways are primed to take advantage of that. And in terms of JW history, one of the things I was proudest of when I was a Jehovah's Witness was the fact that our forefathers had marched with these big picket signs that said religion is a snare and a racket. I really thought that was cool, and I think that that kind of message could appeal to a lot of disillusioned people.
That's good news.
And while Jehovah's Witnesses don't get involved in electoral politics, they do share a lot of the culturally conservative positions that most mainstream evangelicals have. They're anti-abortion, they're anti-gay, anti-trans, anti-evolution, pro-religiously motivated homeschooling. The biggest thing they lack is Jesus.
Jesus Christ.
Jehovah's Witnesses are not Trinitarian. They do not believe that Jesus is God.
You see, we are under obligation to bear witness to Jehovah, to tell the truth about him, and to expose false teachings that misrepresent Jehovah. And a classic example of an unscriptural dogma that God's people have exposed is the Trinity.
And because of that, they consciously talk about Jehovah way more than they talk about Jesus. It is baked into their brand.
Well, Jehovah's people continue to uphold the excellencies of the only true God.
In my opinion, the problem with this is that pretty much everyone, including a lot of atheists, think that following the teachings of Jesus is a fine idea. And pretty much nobody wants to worship the Old Testament God. Even Jehovah's Witnesses' entire theology is based around this idea that soon, very soon, Armageddon's going to come, and then don't worry, we won't have to deal with all that scary doom and gloom Old Testament stuff. It'll just be a nice paradise. But Jehovah's Witnesses, and this is a long story, watch previous videos, which I'll link in the bet their entire brand on Jehovah being a more culturally popular way of saying the divine name or the tetragrammaton in the Bible, YHWH.
Jehovah dealt with greedy Achan. Jehovah's hatred for a lying tongue.
And I can't prove this, but in my anecdotal experience living in a very Christian area, working with a lot of Christians and watching a lot of Christian church feeds of various denominations that pop up on my YouTube channel for some reason, and I watch them, I'm fine. Anecdotally, it seems to me that this just is no longer the case. It is not at all uncommon to go to a church service or watch one of their streams and hear them talk about Yahweh.
Israelites believed his name was so holy they wouldn't say it or write it. They shorthanded it. And so oftentimes in the Old Testament in particular, when you read Yahweh or Jehovah, it's just going to say the Lord in all caps. They didn't want to say his name. They thought it was too holy.
Now, that word Yahweh is the ancient Hebrew form of the verb he will be. And this is the personal name of the God of Israel. It appears over 6,500 times in the Old Testament. They added an A and an E, so it became Yahweh. By the time we have the Latin Bible, it became Jehovah.
It's in a lot of Christian music.
So we sing Yahweh, Jehovah, Jehovah. Say your name is Yahweh.
It's becoming a part of the Christian lingua franca. I just wanted to sound fancy. It's hard to explain how important this is to Jehovah's Witnesses. Their entire sales pitch, the thing that locks people in, is the idea that God's name was taken out of the Bible, but Jehovah's Witnesses have accurately put Jehovah's name first, not just in their own translation of the Bible, but in their worship. God is not impersonal. He's not just called Lord. He has a name and it's Jehovah, and you can be his friend, his little buddy, his pal. They present this like forbidden knowledge, but it just isn't anymore. It's so easy for anyone to find this. There's a good chance that if somebody is really online and Christian already, that they already know this and would be a little baffled by the fact that Witnesses are presenting this like they're the only people who know it. The videos I showed in that montage are all pretty recent, and some have millions of views. And then there's the Google factor. Let's say in the off chance you're able to magically get someone to study the Bible with you, and you manage to dissuade them from Googling anything about the religion, but they just so happen to watch some Bible content on YouTube for fun, and then they find out that your entire narrative is just total BS. And yet, even today, I get the same question now when I tell people that I used to be a Jehovah's Witness that I got when I was a witness, which is, who is Jehovah and what is he witnessing? Remember what I said? People don't understand apostrophes.
Glorifying Jehovah's name as his witnesses.
But I believe that the governing body and the Watchtower shareholders, who are all also Jehovah's Witnesses, by the way, is aware of that Jesus problem specifically. I think they are very aware of this marketing issue, and that's why I believe they made their whole previous convention, their summer convention series, the Jesus Convention, and invested hundreds of millions of dollars into this Jesus movie vanity project. How can anyone say we're not Christian? Look how many millions of dollars we spent making the worst Jesus movie of all time.
Suddenly, Jehovah's angel stood before them, and Jehovah's glory gleamed around them, and they became very fearful.
Do not be afraid.
I think JW leadership also sees the success of Christian films like the God's Not Deadiverse and think to themselves, we could totally do that. Jehovah's Witnesses already make stuff of a similar quality, damning with faint praise. It's just that their stuff doesn't appeal to more mainstream Christians, and right now it's all sort of in-house at jw.org. So it is my speculation that this is the reason why the group is making this movie studio against all common sense and the will of their actual members. The crappiest Christian AI slop you've ever seen will rack up tens of millions of views on YouTube. Slightly above average film productions can make hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office for a wide release if the advertising aims at Christians and evangelical types. The governing body, I speculate, are aware of this, and they think that they could potentially, eventually, compete in that space to convert new people to Jehovah's Witnesses. And if that is what they're doing, I think it's pretty smart. I do think they would have way more success making decent quality productions and putting them on YouTube instead of putting a couple pasty guys at a street corner with a sign. But they're not doing a great job of this either. First of all, I think Jehovah's Witnesses underestimate how deeply unappealing their films are to anybody outside of the group. The God's Not Dead films are Christian propaganda, but unless I just don't know enough about Christianity, which is, I mean, that is true, I don't. But it doesn't seem to me like they're propaganda for one specific denomination of Christianity. They're mostly, broad strokes, the world is so secular and immoral, it's hard to be be a Christian right now. But Jehovah's Witnesses are a cult who brand themselves on being no part of the world, and certainly no part of Christendom. And so many of the group's stances spring more from contrarianism than scripture, IMO. And last but definitely not least, the group is not selling a product that is super appealing compared to other stuff on the market. You can get all of this crap by joining a normal neighborhood church that isn't a high control, high demand religion that's going to cast you out forever and ruin your entire life if you ever leave.
Bye.
That's why I've been insistent on this channel that the governing body aren't just greedy business leaders. They are that, but they aren't just that. They don't run Watchtower like a business. They run it like crazy people who think they know how to run a business because Jesus gave them special powers because the world is going to end, but they're not sure when, so they just need to keep this thing running for a few more years. If they wanted to be a purely capitalist, profitable enterprise, they would just be the Mormon Church. They would start mandating tithing. They would encourage members to have as many kids as possible because that's the most reliable way to supply new members. And I don't think they would demand that new members looking to convert cover up their tattoos and quit smoking and dress a certain way and act a certain way, talk a certain way, all at risk of being socially outcast. But the governing body are not business majors. They are just crazy people exclusively.
We thank Jehovah.
There's no nice way to say that. Maybe there is, but I don't feel like it. They are delusional narcissists in the purest sense of the word. Now, many CEOs are possibly narcissists. See John Rawson's book, The Psychopath Test. But most CEOs don't think that their company was chosen by Jesus Christ to rebuild society after a violent Armageddon. It just makes them really ruthless, cynical capitalists who have no problem firing people, which is definitely bad. But when you add the religious component on top of it, the governing body are worse. So Jehovah's Witnesses don't have a good product. Their brand is really bad. From my point of view, they can't change the things that are most negative about the group, because the things that are most negative about the group in terms of public perception are the things most core to the group's identity. Blood transfusions have become this martyrdom. I don't know that they can go back on that. First of all, for legal reasons, it would open up the mother of all class action lawsuits, but I also think being willing to die for something is perversely appealing to people in these sorts of groups. And if you take that away from them, it suddenly undermines the sacrifice of all those who died for the cause. So I don't think they would do that. I don't think that beards were ever a core part of the JW identity, but modesty and being no part of the world is. Not celebrating holidays, having given up all of this fun stuff, that's a part of the group's core identity. And preaching, the least appealing thing about having to join Jehovah's Witnesses, is definitely a part of the group's identity, even if they moved totally away from door to door and towards things like informal, interpersonal conversion and standing on street corners and telephones. They're going to be preaching. And who wants to be a salesman for a part-time job and not get paid for it? Not a lot of people. Not me. So these are just some of the issues that I've been thinking about when it comes to Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't think that they can overcome this, but let me know what you think, if you can think of any other major issue. I didn't even talk about CSA in this video because it's obviously a massive issue within the group, but let's be real, people become Catholics every day, and they're also pretty well known for that. That does not seem to be a mitigating factor in people joining a religion, which is bad in my opinion. I don't really know how they're going to come out of this tailspin. It's a very slow tailspin. They've got a lot of fuel to burn, but they are burning it, and they're not really capable of adding more fuel to their plane that's going down. This analogy got away from me. Thank you, and free Palestine.
That was not brought to you by artificial intelligence, just so you know. Bye.